Paris is a city accustomed to revolutions. Some arrive with gunpowder, some with poetry, and some, unexpectedly, with code. On an early autumn morning in 2023, while the Seine drifted quietly beneath the bridges and joggers traced their habitual paths along the riverbank, three young men sat in a cramped sixth-floor apartment in the ninth arrondissement, surrounded not by political manifestos, but by laptops, half-written research notes, and the faint smell of burnt espresso. This was not yet Mistral AI. This was not yet a company valued in the billions. This was only the moment before lightning strikes, the fragile, electric silence before a continent awakens to a new ambition. Arthur Mensch, the quietest of the trio, sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, coding with monk-like focus. His glasses reflected the pale screen light, though behind them his eyes carried something sharper than mathematical certainty, a conviction, almost stubborn in its calmness, that Europe deserved more than to be an AI spectator. Next to him, in a chair that had seen better years, sat Timothy Lacroix, broad-shouldered, restless, endlessly energetic. He spoke in bursts, thoughts overflowing faster than his mouth could contain them, pacing the room on occasion to release the overflow. Every time his heel tapped the floor, the old building vibrated faintly, as if Paris itself were listening. Across the table, leaning back with a strategist's stillness, was Charles Guarenton. His background, data science, engineering, and product building, had shaped him into a founder who did not reach for words until he knew their weight. His laptop was open, yet untouched for several minutes. He simply watched the other two, as if calculating the future. On the whiteboard behind them, written in uneven handwriting, Europe needs its own frontier. Open models, responsible power, speed plus elegance. Encircled twice. LLM, made in Europe. Tim muttered, "It looks naive when written like that." "It only looks naive before it works," Arthur replied, not looking up from his keyboard. Charles smirked. "Once it works, it looks inevitable." That line would later be quoted in interviews, repeated by investors, echoed by journalists. But here, in this apartment, it was spoken casually, just another comment sliding into the morning air. At the time, Silicon Valley was roaring with breakthroughs. OpenAI had already pushed the frontier. Anthropic and Google DeepMind were racing at breakneck speed. Billions of dollars were flowing into the United States, while Europe watched from across the ocean, brilliant in research, hesitant in industry, fragmented in regulation. A continent with top-tier scientists, Arthur would later reflect, but no industrial muscle in AI. France, in particular, had nurtured generations of mathematicians and engineers, yet most were pulled inevitably toward American labs, American salaries, American compute. It created a new kind of brain drain, not of scholars to academia, but of talent to AI giants. Tim lifted his gaze from his laptop. "People will say we're insane." Charles shrugged. "People said the same about every European trying to build rockets, chips, or cloud infrastructure. They're only right until someone proves them wrong. We don't need to outspin the Americans," Arthur added. "We just need to outthink them." He paused, hands hovering above the keyboard. "And we need to be fast." Speed, la vitesse, was the word that would define them. Speed in research, speed in iteration, speed in ambition. The days that followed were relentless. Not because they were pitching investors, that would come later. Not because they were assembling compute clusters, that would come much later. But because they were defining the soul of what they wanted to build. Was Mistral meant to be a European open AI? A commercial model lab? A research collective? "It has to be all three," Arthur said one night, exhausted but unwavering. "There is no time to choose." Tim collapsed into the apartment's only couch. "And we'll do it with a team of what?" "Three. We'll find more," Charles said calmly. "But first, we need proof. Something undeniable." They were not yet founders. They were researchers with a shared frustration and a shared dream. Yet the chemistry was unmistakable. Three minds aligned by urgency. Three personalities orbiting one gravitational conviction. Europe cannot surrender its technological sovereignty. Not again. Not this time. The world would later be stunned at how fast Mistral released its first models. Models that shouldn't have been possible with so small a team, so early, so quietly. But inside that apartment, the miracle looked far from glamorous. Lines of code scribbled across notebooks. Models failing to converge at 2 a.m. Arguments over architecture decisions. Overheating laptops. Coffee-stained diagrams of transformer blocks. And an endless, punishing focus on efficiency. Not bigger, not heavier, not brute force American scale. More elegant, more optimized, more European. Arthur stared at his screen. Something wasn't working. The model's training run had collapsed unexpectedly. Again, Tim leaned over. If we restructure the attention layers, we might gain gradient stability. Charles analyzed the logs. Or we adjust the initialization scheme. We're losing variance too early. Arthur rubbed his temples. We fix both. Tim laughed. You know, normal startups try to solve simple problems first. We're not a normal startup, Arthur said. No one disagreed. Late at night, the city hummed with distant nightlife. But inside the apartment, silence reigned. The trio stared at the monitor as the first successful training curve appeared, smooth, ascending, promising. None of them spoke. None of them breathed. It felt like witnessing a heartbeat. Finally, Tim whispered, "We're really doing this." Arthur smiled faintly. "We are." Charles nodded. "Then tomorrow, we raise." Raise. A simple word that would soon ignite one of the fastest funding rounds in European technology history. But at this moment, the world still had no idea. No journalists were watching. No investors were calling. No headlines were written. Just three founders in a small Paris apartment, staring at a graph that would soon reshape Europe's role in AI. And the revolution was only beginning. Morning sunlight spilled through the apartment windows in soft, buttery beams. Dust danced between them like lazy particles of magic. Outside, the sounds of Paris awakened. The rattle of cafe shutters lifting, the hum of scooters weaving through narrow streets, a vendor whistling as he arranged fresh baguettes in a basket. Inside the small, cluttered space of the soon-to-be Mistral founders, it felt as if reality stood still. Arthur stretched, vertebrae cracking. Tim rummaged through a pile of energy drink cans for one that still had a few sips left. Charles, already showered and crisp in a dark blue shirt, watched them with the amused look of a man who accepted chaos as the price of genius. Arthur finally spoke. "We need infrastructure. Compute. Hardware." Tim groaned. "And money." Charles folded his arms, expression sharpening. "We will get it." There was something in his tone, an unshakable confidence, that made the other two pause. Charles was not one to boast, not one for theatrical claims. When he said "we will get it," it was not a wish. It was a calculation. Later that day, they met in a small co-working cafe near Saint-Cyr, a district sometimes called the Silicon Valley of Paris. Though the comparison was generous, the area buzzed with young startups, founders hunched over laptops, investors in tailored suits pretending to be casual. But the trio was not there to blend in. They were there to make a declaration. Over a simple wooden table cluttered with notebooks, Arthur began outlining what they would tell investors. "We're building an open, efficient large language model from Europe. State of the art. Competitive with anything from the US." Tim added, "Faster, leaner, better optimized. Minimal compute footprint, but ridiculous performance." Charles leaned in. "And we're doing it responsibly. Transparent releases. Clear governance. Europe's values, with Silicon Valley's execution speed." Arthur nodded. No more watching from the sidelines. They paused as the waiter delivered tiny porcelain cups of espresso. Tim downed his shot in one gulp. "Okay," he said. "So who do we pitch first?" All three looked at each other and burst into laughter. Because the truth was, they didn't need a pitch list. Paris had been waiting for them. You cannot hide genius in a city that thrives on intellect. In the weeks before this moment, whispers had spread in elite circles. Former Meta AI researchers. DeepMind-level capabilities. French talent returning to build something continental, sovereign, ambitious. Rumor outran reality. Investors started contacting them even before they were ready. First a quiet email, then a meeting request, then an introduction from an advisor, then another, and another. A European LLM lab? A team with researchers from Meta and DeepMind? France had just elected to pour billions into tech sovereignty. Timing was perfect, almost cinematic. One evening, they reviewed a spreadsheet of interested funds. Tim stared. "We haven't even built a deck." Charles smirked. "We don't need a deck." Arthur blinked. "Is that allowed?" Tim responded before Charles could. "In Silicon Valley? No. In Europe? Also no." But in this exact moment in history, he looked at them with a grin stretching from mischief to inevitability. Yes. The following week, the trio walked into a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Paris skyline. The investor, one of Europe's most respected venture capitalists, greeted them personally, shaking their hands with the eager enthusiasm of a man who knew opportunity when he saw it. They sat. No pitch deck. No slides. No prepared speech. The investor leaned forward. "So," he said, eyes shining, "tell me what you're building." Arthur took a breath. "We want to build the most efficient, capable LLMs in the world. Models designed for real deployment, not just research prestige. Lean, powerful, and open." The investor nodded slowly. "And why you?" Tim answered with the unfiltered honesty that made him charismatic. "Because we're fast. Faster than labs with 10 times our size. Faster than anyone in Europe. And because we understand the frontier. We've built these systems before. We know where the inefficiencies are." Charles completed the triangle. "And because Europe needs this. Now more than ever. We're not building toys. We're building infrastructure." A silence followed. The kind weighted not by doubt, but by calculation. The investor leaned back. "How much are you raising?" Charles spoke the number, large, by European standards. The investor didn't flinch. Instead, "When can we wire?" Arthur blinked. Tim stared. Charles smiled like a chess player who'd planned this move hours ago. The investor continued. "And one more thing. Let me know who else I should bring into the round." It was as if the world had shifted by a degree. Something irreversible had begun. What happened next would later be called one of the fastest fundraising rounds in European history. Investors reached out in waves. Some politely, some aggressively, some almost desperately. This is the team. This is the moment. This is Europe's chance. Money flowed like a river, accelerating with each meeting. The trio tried to maintain control, setting boundaries, choosing carefully, but the pressure increased by the hour. At one point, Tim stared at the incoming messages and muttered, "If one more VC tries to hop on a quick call, I'm throwing my phone into the Seine." Arthur chuckled. "You won't. You need the calendar app." Charles simply replied, "We need to anchor the round now, before this becomes chaos." Tim nodded. Arthur agreed. Within days, the round closed. The amount astonished the European tech community. The speed shocked even Silicon Valley. The valuation, pre-product, pre-model, pre-anything, became the stuff of modern legend. But inside the apartment, the founders sat in stunned silence. Not celebrating, not cheering, processing. Tim finally spoke. "So, we have a company." Arthur exhaled. "Yes." Charles corrected gently. "No. Now we have a responsibility." The papers were signed. The funding was secured. The pressure, immense, immediate, settled on their shoulders. And now they faced a problem more terrifying than compute shortages or model collapse. What do we call the company? Names carry prophecy. Names shape narrative. Names echo. The trio gathered that evening around the small kitchen table of the apartment, stacks of scribbled notes and rejected suggestions scattered like fallen leaves. Tim read from his notebook. Euro LLM. Arthur groaned. "We're trying to build world-class AI, not a cable company." "Fine," Tim muttered. "Next, Gall AI." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Tim, we're not a theme park." Okay. He flipped the page. "Next, Alpine Intelligence." Arthur frowned. "Are we a ski resort?" Tim sighed dramatically and tossed his notebook aside. "Okay, you name one." Arthur hesitated, then spoke softly. "Mistral." Charles leaned forward. "The wind." "Not just any wind," Arthur clarified. "The Mistral is fast, cold, powerful. It reshapes landscapes. It clears the sky." Tim's eyes widened. "A wind that sweeps across Europe." Charles nodded slowly. "And it matches our philosophy. Fast, efficient, uncompromising." Tim smiled. "Also sounds cool." Arthur added, "And no one else has taken it." That sealed it. The storm had a name. Mistral AI. A small name for a future that would become enormous. Their first official day as Mistral AI began with the same ritual. Coffee, code, and a sense of quiet rebellion. But now, they needed people. A team. A world-class team. The kind of researchers and engineers whose resumes alone could power a product roadmap. Arthur outlined the challenge on a whiteboard. Europe's best AI talent drained to US labs. Salaries at Meta, Google, OpenAI massive. Compute access limited. Bureaucracy suffocating. Skepticism high. Expectations very high. Tim stared at the list. Fantastic. So basically, our hiring plan is defy gravity. Charles folded his arms. We don't need to hire hundreds. We're not competing on scale. We're competing on brilliance. Arthur added, and efficiency. Tim grinned. And charm. Charm is not a technical requirement. Arthur noted. Tim is right. Charles said unexpectedly. People will join us because they believe in us. That's persuasion, not payroll. They began drafting messages to researchers they admired, some in Europe, some in the US, some in Asia. The first replies came within hours. Exciting idea. Do you have compute? Interested, but you're too early stage. Keep me posted. Then came a surprise. Let's talk. I've been waiting for something like this. That was from a top transformer architecture expert at a leading US lab. Tim held up his phone like a trophy. Recruiting is on. While hiring began, the founders worked on something equally important. Their research philosophy. Arthur wrote it on the whiteboard, each line underlined twice. Small teams, not armies. Speed over bureaucracy. Optimization over brute force. Open release when possible. European values, global ambition. Responsible deployment without paralysis. Tim tapped the last one. You think we'll get attacked for this? Arthur nodded. Of course. If we're too open, we'll be criticized. If we're too closed, also criticized. Charles added. If we succeed, critics multiply. If we fail, we disappear. Tim sighed. So, we're in a no-win situation. No, Arthur said softly. We're in a high-pressure, high-impact situation. Charles smiled. Which is exactly where we thrive. By late evenings, the three would return to coding, refining architecture, experimenting with attention mechanisms, testing sparse layers, optimizing training pipelines, compressing weights, rebalancing initialization distributions. Their goal wasn't to match the cutting-edge American labs. Their goal was to surpass them with a fraction of the resources. The model, codenamed Wind Seed, began training on a cluster assembled through partnerships, early credits, and negotiated access. Every day, they watched its performance metrics rise. Every night, they hunted the flaws that kept it from being perfect. One evening, the perplexity curve suddenly spiked, badly. Tim slammed his palms on the table. No, 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 why? Arthur zoomed into the logs. I found it. A masking bug. Charles leaned closer. Can we fix it? Arthur typed rapidly, the only sound in the room the rhythm of his keyboard. Done. Tim restarted the training. The curve stabilized. When the line smoothed and resumed its upward trajectory, Tim fell back into his chair with an exhale that was half laughter, half exhaustion. You know, this is going to get harder. Arthur nodded. I hope so. Charles raised an eyebrow. You hope so? Arthur shrugged. If it's too easy, someone else will do it. One morning, as sunlight washed the apartment in pale gold, Arthur's phone vibrated. A message from a well-known European government official. Not the kind who casually reaches out. Not the kind who writes long emails. Just one line. We should talk about European AI sovereignty. Arthur froze. Tim looked up from his laptop. Everything okay? Charles saw Arthur's expression and understood instantly. Who is it? Arthur handed him the phone. Charles read the message, and for the first time since founding Mistral, his voice carried something rarely heard. This is big. Tim leaned in. What do we do? Charles answered. We prepare. Arthur nodded slowly. This is no longer just research. No longer just a startup. Tim whispered the words they were all thinking. This just became political. And so the circle widened. Mistral's ambitions were no longer theirs alone. Governments, institutions, and investors sensed a shift. Europe was waking up, and the storm was forming. 3 days after the message arrived, the founders walked through the polished marble halls of a European government building. Flags lined the corridor, France, Germany, Italy, the EU, reminders of the political and cultural tapestry they were now stepping into. A security guard escorted them into a quiet meeting room overlooking a courtyard where ivy climbed the ancient stone walls. It felt surreal. Not long ago, they were cramped in a sixth-floor Paris apartment debugging model failures. Now, they were here. The official entered with a warm but firm presence. Arthur, Timothy, Charles, thank you for coming. They exchanged greetings, took their seats. The official began with no preamble. Europe has been slow. Too slow. We have watched the US capture AI mindshare. We have watched China scale. And Europe, your home, risks becoming dependent on foreign intelligence systems. The founders exchanged glances. They had said these exact words countless times in private. We need champions, the official continued. We need companies building frontier models that reflect our culture, our values, our independence. Your work is ambitious, and ambition is precisely what Europe requires. A long silence followed. Arthur finally spoke, voice steady. We don't want to be symbolic. We want to be competitive. The official smiled. That's why we invited you. Charles joined in. We will move fast. Faster than regulations, faster than established giants. But we need compute and clear pathways to scale. Tim leaned forward. And support, not interference. The official nodded. Build well. Build safely. Build boldly. The rest, we can discuss. When the meeting ended, they stepped outside into crisp afternoon air. Tim breathed deeply. We're in it now. Arthur nodded. This isn't just a startup anymore. Charles finished the thought. It's a cause. And with that realization, the weight on their shoulders transformed. It no longer felt like pressure. It felt like purpose. In the days that followed, their small apartment transformed into a command center. Maps of compute clusters pinned to walls. Whiteboards filled with architecture sketches. Dozens of sticky notes with candidate hires. Coffee cups collecting in corners like geological formations. Tim paced constantly. Arthur coded constantly. Charles planned constantly. The energy was manic, electric. The atmosphere, borderline monastic. One night, around 2 a.m., Arthur finally stood and stretched with a groan. Tim asked, "Did we break you?" Arthur shook his head. "Just thinking." "Dangerous," Tim joked. Arthur ignored it. "We should release something soon." Charles looked up from his laptop. "We're not ready." "Not a full model," Arthur clarified. "A demo. A glimpse. Something that proves we're not smoke and mirrors." Tim paused. "A teaser." Arthur nodded. Charles considered the idea, his face contemplative. It could attract talent. "And pressure," he said. Tim corrected him. "Pressure is inevitable. Momentum isn't." Charles exhaled, conceding. "Fine. But it must be perfect." Arthur returned to his screen with renewed focus. The countdown to their first public moment had begun. A week later, they gathered around the main workstation, eyes fixed on the console. WinSeed, the experimental early model, had finished a training run and was ready for sampling. Arthur typed the first prompt. Tim muttered, "If it outputs nonsense, I'm jumping out the window." Charles replied dryly, "We're on the first floor. It's the principal." The cursor blinked. Then words appeared. "Hello? I am here." Tim froze. Arthur leaned closer. Charles allowed the smallest hint of a smile. Arthur typed again. "What are you?" The model responded. "A system designed to understand and generate language. But mostly, I am the beginning." A shiver ran through the room. Tim whispered, "It's poetic." Arthur nodded. "Unintentionally poetic." Charles added, "But very on-brand." They tested more prompts. The model performed surprisingly well, coherent, concise, elegant. It wasn't frontier level yet, but it was more than enough to prove their talent. More importantly, it was enough to show the world they were real. A few days later, the founders met with their small but growing team in a borrowed office space near Republic. Arthur stood before a digital screen showing performance graphs. "We're ready to share a preview," he said. "Something technical, something substantive." A researcher asked, "Open weights?" Arthur hesitated. "We will, eventually, but not for the preview." Tim added, "We show a benchmark. A snippet. Enough to make people curious." Charles looked at the group, expression serious. "This will define us. Once we show who we are, expectations will skyrocket." "That is good, but unforgiving." The room nodded. They discussed release timing, communication strategy, safety considerations, documentation, messaging. How much transparency would be enough? How much would be too much? Every decision felt like threading a needle between innovation and scrutiny. By the end, they had a plan. Mistral AI's first public appearance would be subtle, powerful, unmistakable. Not hype, not spectacle. Precision. The European way. The evening before the reveal, the three founders gathered in the apartment one last time before moving to proper offices. The room was quieter than usual. The whiteboard, covered in layers of equations and diagrams, stood like a monument to their early struggle. The air held a sense of ritual, like astronauts preparing for launch. Arthur spoke first. France believes in us. Charles nodded. Europe believes in us. Tim added. And if tomorrow goes well, the world will take notice. They each sat with their thoughts. Arthur asked softly, Are you nervous? Tim replied, Terrified. Charles answered, Focused. Arthur smiled. Those are acceptable states. They raised their glasses, not champagne, but cheap, cold beers from the corner shop. To what? Tim asked. Arthur answered. To the storm we're about to unleash. They clinked bottles. Outside, the wind picked up. Not a metaphor. Not symbolism. Just the real Mistral wind, cold, powerful, sweeping across the city as if acknowledging its namesake. At dawn, they pushed the release live. A technical blog post. A benchmark. A short demo clip. A quiet announcement. No marketing. No theatrics. No claims of revolution. Just excellence. Within minutes, the post spread across researcher circles. Within an hour, the tech community buzzed. Within a day, journalists ran headlines. A new AI challenger emerges from Europe. Mistral AI, the fast, efficient rival to American giants. A French startup with global ambition. Recruiters messaged them nonstop. Investors tried to re-enter the round. Engineers sent CVs with subject lines like, ready to help build Europe's frontier AI. Governments reached out for meetings. And in the middle of it, the founders sat in a cafe on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis, watching the world react to their work. Tim laughed. Arthur smiled quietly. Charles simply said, This is only chapter 1. And indeed it was. The storm had arrived. The cafe on Boulevard Saint-Germain was half empty when they met one rainy evening. Arthur Minch, Timothy Lacroix, and Guillaume Lampel. 3 minds, each sharpened by years in the crucible of cutting-edge AI research, each different in temperament, yet aligned in one conviction. Europe needed its own engine of intelligence. Arthur arrived first, as he often did, notebook in hand, filled with odd geometric diagrams and speculative architectures. He was the strategist, the one who saw both the dusty corners of code and the political horizon of global AI power. Timothy came next, quiet, analytical, the mathematician who treated neural networks like puzzles waiting for elegant solutions. His glasses caught reflections of the cafe lights like 2 faint stars. Guillaume arrived last, in a rush, laptops still warm from experimentation. Guillaume lived at the speed of thought, the prototyper, the hacker, the one who built first and asked questions never. They ordered espresso, then another, then wine, because French problems required French remedies. Arthur said it plainly, softly. What if we build the model Europe deserves? Not a copy of American systems. Not a cautious academic experiment. Not a policy-shaped Frankenstein with all potential neutered. A model. A company. A movement. Europe's own AI Gale. Timothy shrugged in the way only a mathematician could shrug, resigned to the inevitability of truth. Guillaume leaned back, eyes brightening. We'll need compute. A lot of compute. We'll find it, Arthur replied. And capital, Timothy added. We'll attract it, Guillaume said. Outside, rain whipped across the boulevard, swirling like a miniature storm. Inside, Mistral was born, not yet incorporated, not yet funded, not yet recognized, but real, inevitable, like pressure building in the atmosphere before a windstorm. News traveled strangely in the Paris tech world, a rumor here, a whisper there. Something was brewing, something big, something that made investors sit up straighter and researchers check who was leaving Meta. 3 respected scientists. A European vision. A promise of radical openness. Within weeks, the founders received private messages from investors who ordinarily required months of due diligence. Large funds, sovereign funds, strategic funds, all hungry for a shot at the next frontier. The founders hadn't even written a full pitch deck yet. On a warm June evening, they met at Arthur's apartment. Whiteboard walls, empty coffee cups on the table, the faint hum of the city through an open window. Guillaume circled a line of code on the screen. Timothy paced, reciting numbers. Arthur drafted the first formal articulation of their mission. Build frontier-level intelligence, efficient, transparent, sovereign. 3 lines. No marketing fluff. Around midnight, as they tested another experimental architecture, Paris erupted with Bastille Day fireworks, though the holiday was weeks away. It must have been a wedding or a private celebration. The thunderous burst of color outside felt symbolic. Arthur smiled. Seems someone is celebrating early. Guillaume said, maybe they know what we're about to unleash. Timothy added, let's hope we finish the model before they run out of fireworks. It became one of the fastest fundraising rounds in European startup history. Emails flew, calls buzzed, fund managers whispered, this could be Europe's open AI. This could be the strategic anchor for EU sovereignty. This could be the model that breaks the American monopoly. Every investor wanted in. Valuation climbed like the ascent of a rising storm front. 20 million euros, 50 million euros, 80 million euros. By autumn, the term sheet sat on a clean table in a minimalist conference room. 105 million euros, seed round. More money than many companies raised in their entire lifetime. Arthur studied the document, expression steady. Timothy checked the technical milestones attached. Guillaume tapped his foot, waiting to sign so he could get back to training the next experiment. When they finally put pen to paper, a symbolic wind rustled the trees outside the glass windows. A coincidence, but it felt poetic. Europe had backed them. Now they had to deliver. The founders returned to work with a kind of controlled fury. They slept in shifts. They coded through weekends. They refined mixture of experts layers, rewritten attention kernels, optimized GPU memory footprints. Every morning felt like waking into a war room. Guillaume joked rarely but produced constantly. Timothy broke models only to rebuild them stronger. Arthur, the bridge between research and strategy, managed both friction and momentum with gentle authority. They shared one conviction. Openness was not a liability. It was Europe's competitive weapon. Their first model launched quietly online, without fanfare or corporate theatrics. Minutes later, the internet noticed. Then Twitter noticed. Then the global AI community noticed. Benchmarks arrived. Comparisons followed. Engineers posted shocked reactions. How is this only a few months old? This is ridiculously efficient. Europe has finally entered the race. The founders watched the traffic graphs spike like heartbeats. Guillaume whispered, it's happening. Timothy exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. Arthur said nothing. He just sat, eyes glowing, taking in the storm they had unleashed. A storm named Mistral. Startup legends often romanticize the grind but skip the economics. But the truth was simple. When Mistral's valuation surged, so did the founder's net worth. Not through luck, not through chance, but through building something the world suddenly could not ignore. Investors called the founders young titans. Newspapers wrote profiles. Governments sent invitations. Competitors watched nervously. Yet the founders kept the same habits. Cheap coffee, long nights, hand-edited code, arguments about architecture that lasted until dawn. Money changed the world around them, but not the wind inside them. By winter, it became clear. Paris was no longer just a city of art and romance. It had become one of the epicenters of artificial intelligence. Investors flew in weekly. Engineers relocated from London, Berlin, even San Francisco. Cafes near the Sorbonne filled with students debating transformer architectures instead of philosophy. Everywhere the founders went, they could feel a shift, a subtle tightening of the air, a sense of expectation. At Station F, a journalist approached Arthur for an interview. Did you expect this global frenzy? Arthur smiled mildly. I expected curiosity, but not hysteria. Timothy added, we launched a model, not a revolution. The journalist laughed. Too late. You've already sparked one. Guillaume said nothing, tapping rapidly on his laptop, adjusting a tokenizer. But he felt it too. The world was watching them. Success breeds pressure, and pressure creates cracks. It happened during the training of Mistral 1.3, the model that was supposed to push efficiency even further. A subtle bug, a misalignment in a distributed training kernel, corrupted several days of progress. 8,000 GPU hours, gone. Guillaume stared at the logs with disbelief. Timothy pulled up the distributed traces, heart sinking. Arthur rubbed his eyes, exhausted. It's my fault, Guillaume said quietly. No, Timothy corrected. It's our infrastructure. Arthur added, then we fix it. For 2 days they didn't go home. They slept in conference chairs. They argued fiercely but precisely. They ripped apart huge sections of code and rewrote them from scratch. At 2:14 a.m., after another failed run, tension hit a breaking point. Guillaume slammed his hands on the table. This is impossible. Timothy shot back. Nothing is impossible, only misconfigured. Arthur intervened, voice sharp. Stop. We're all tired. Silence. Then Arthur lowered his tone. We're three people fighting a global race. Of course it feels impossible. That's exactly why it matters. His words held them together. By morning, they isolated the root cause. By afternoon, the model was training again. By the next week, it worked, better than expected. Crises have a way of binding people. This one welded them. For years, the global AI landscape had been a near duopoly. America and China, the giants, OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, Baidu, Tencent, controlled the frontier. Europe was the spectator. Until now. Within 6 months, three shocking comparisons appeared. Mistral's models matched or exceeded similar-sized models from Silicon Valley. Their efficiency per parameter ratio stunned engineers worldwide. Their open releases attracted an army of contributors and testers. Forums buzzed. How did they do this so fast? Are the French secretly wizards? This will force the Americans to rethink everything. The founders felt pride and fear. They knew expectations could crush even the strongest teams. They knew every success added weight to their shoulders. But they also knew something else. Europe, for the first time in decades, was not playing catch-up. It was leading. A week later, a European minister visited Mistral's headquarters. A convoy of black cars. Security. Photographers. The minister toured the lab, shook hands, asked scripted questions. Then he said, "You three are the future of European technology." Guillaume nearly smiled. Timothy adjusted his glasses. Arthur answered politely, "Europe's future shouldn't depend on three people. We're just trying to pull the wind in the right direction." The minister didn't fully understand, but he nodded. After the entourage left, the founders stood by the window overlooking Paris. Guillaume whispered, "They think we're building magic." Timothy added, "They don't see the sleepless nights." Arthur finished, "They see the wind, not the pressure that makes it." It was a moment of clarity, a reminder that mythology grows faster than reality. They refused to believe their own legend. They focused on work. This was the decision that shocked the industry most. Mistral released a powerful model openly. No paywall, no API-only restrictions. A bold gamble. A break from American caution. A direct challenge to the established narrative. Critics warned, "It's irresponsible. You'll lose control. This will attract regulators." But Arthur saw openness as Europe's strategic accelerator. Timothy believed transparency improved safety through community oversight. Guillaume trusted developers more than he trusted corporate firewalls. And so, the code went public. Within hours, thousands of developers downloaded it. Within days, forks appeared. Within weeks, use cases exploded from education to robotics to creative media. They had ignited a global phenomenon. Late one night, after a particularly intense sprint, the founders ordered cheap pizza and sat on the office floor among empty boxes and notebooks. Guillaume broke the quiet first. "We need more GPUs." Timothy replied, "We need better data center throughput." Arthur added, "And we need to think beyond models." Guillaume raised an eyebrow. "Beyond models?" Arthur nodded slowly. "Yes, models are the spark. Infrastructure is the storm." Timothy closed his laptop slowly. "You mean building Europe's AI backbone?" Arthur smiled. "I mean building the windmills that will shape the next century." A long silence followed. Three founders. One vision. A continent waiting for its place in the future. Outside, the Paris night was still. Inside, the next chapter was forming like a front of warm, rising air. The three founders of Mistral AI sat around a long oak table inside their Paris headquarters, surrounded by half-drunk coffees, network diagrams pinned to whiteboards, and a persistent hum from the server racks downstairs. The room felt almost too small now. Not physically, but conceptually. They had built a model. They had shocked the world. They had revived Europe's technological image. But the next question pressed down on them like atmospheric pressure before a storm. How do you scale this into a continent-spanning AI ecosystem? Timothy tapped a marker against a whiteboard filled with arrows and acronyms. "We cannot keep relying on American compute. Not forever." Guillaume, slouched in his chair, added, "Or American cloud. Or American chips." Arthur exhaled slowly. He had been thinking the same thing for months. "Gentlemen," he said, leaning forward, France doesn't just need a model. Europe doesn't just need a model. They need a new backbone. The word hung in the air. Backbone. It meant more than GPU clusters. It meant autonomy. It meant sovereignty. It meant responsibility. Guillaume straightened. You're talking about infrastructure. Arthur nodded. I'm talking about Europe's AI bloodstream. If we don't build it, someone else will. And they won't build it for us. Timothy set the marker down. Then it's time to go beyond research. Time to become architects. And just like that, the chapter of Mistral as just another AI lab ended. A new era, heavier, more ambitious, began. The train ride to Brussels was gray and cold, the kind of winter morning that makes everything outside look washed in diluted ink. But the founders weren't looking out the windows. They were reviewing slides, battle plans, cost projections. We need to convince the commission, Arthur murmured. No, corrected Guillaume. We need to convince the commission that they need us. They entered a sleek, glassy building filled with quiet halls and sharp suits. At the top floor, a semicircle of EU commissioners waited. Arthur began the presentation. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't theatrical. He was deliberate. Europe has a unique problem, he said, setting the tone. We want sovereignty, but we outsource the engines of our future. A commissioner raised an eyebrow. What engines, specifically? Timothy clicked the next slide. Compute, he said. Chips. Training clusters. GPU networks. Right now, if Europe wants to train a frontier model, we depend on US infrastructure. Not by choice, by necessity. Another commissioner leaned forward. And you propose, what exactly? Guillaume answered plainly. A European-scale AI infrastructure. Efficient, distributed, sustainable, and fully under our regulatory, ethical, and political framework. The room went quiet. Arthur delivered the final push. If Europe wants to be more than a consumer of AI models built elsewhere, we must build our own industrial foundation. Several commissioners exchanged glances, hesitant, intrigued, unsettled. Finally, the chairwoman spoke. Your ambition is vast. Arthur smiled slightly. So is the century that lies ahead. After the meeting, the founders waited in a private corridor lined with abstract art and minimalist benches. Aides and advisors whispered behind closed doors. Guillaume paced. Timothy scrolled through logs on his phone. Arthur sat absolutely still, eyes distant. Finally, an advisor stepped out. They are interested, she said. But they want guarantees. Timothy frowned. Technical guarantees? Financial ones, she clarified. Arthur nodded slowly. You are asking us to promise we can build something Europe hasn't built before, the advisor continued. And to promise you won't lose control of it. She paused. Can you? Arthur did not hesitate. We will not lose control. And we will not fail. It wasn't arrogance. It was conviction, the only currency that matters when doing what has never been done before. She nodded, satisfied. The commission will follow up with a framework proposal. After she left, Guillaume slumped onto a bench. Why does everything we propose end up sounding like a 1,000-year plan? Arthur smiled. Because building windmills for the whole continent takes time. Timothy added dryly, and money. They all laughed, tension breaking like ice at spring thaw. When the EU meetings leaked, as everything in Brussels eventually does, Paris reacted with both pride and panic. The French ministry invited the founders the next week. The minister, a sharp-eyed man in an expensive suit, wasted no time. You want Europe to build infrastructure, he said. But France must lead it. Arthur remained diplomatic. Our headquarters are here. Our roots are here. But this project belongs to all Europeans. The minister leaned forward. France saved Mistral when it was 3 people in a room. We expect alignment. Guillaume muttered under his breath. Here we go. Timothy stayed silent. Arthur answered cleanly. We are aligned with Europe. Because Europe succeeds when nations cooperate, not compete. The minister didn't look pleased, but he respected the stance. Politics had entered the arena. Big politics. The founders left the meeting knowing. Every nation wanted a piece of them now. Back in Paris, the team convened in their main meeting hall, a room filled with paper, monitors, cables, and a persistent hum from servers below. A slide glowed on the projector. The GPU problem. Guillaume explained. We need tens of thousands of chips. Possibly more. But NVIDIA has a year-long waiting list. AMD is improving, but supply is tight. Europe has no homegrown alternative. Timothy added. And every week of delay means losing momentum. Arthur tapped his notebook slowly. So we need a hybrid strategy. Guillaume nodded. We buy what we can. We optimize what we have. And, long term, we push Europe to build its own silicon. Timothy raised an eyebrow. You want Europe to enter the chip race? Arthur shrugged slightly. Eventually, someone has to plant the seed. They spent the next 2 hours refining procurement strategies, cluster layout, data center positioning, and model scaling curves. They weren't just researchers anymore. They were infrastructure commanders. News travels fast. Fear travels faster. When Silicon Valley realized Mistral planned to build European-scale infrastructure, many dismissed it. But some took it very seriously. A senior Google executive emailed a colleague. If the French manage to decentralize compute across Europe, our dominance ends. Another wrote, they are moving with insane speed. If regulators back them, it'll disrupt the entire global supply chain. On social media, American commentators scoffed. Cute. Europe wants its own AI empire. They don't have the chips. They don't have the talent. But in private, the giants watched nervously. Because they knew the truth. Mistral had already achieved what experts said they could not. If they succeeded again, it would reshape the global AI map. It happened late one night. The kind of night where the office was half lit, the city outside was quiet, and the founders were running on caffeine and stubbornness. Guillaume had just finished drafting a novel distributed compute algorithm. Timothy was refining a system for cross-border load balancing. Arthur was refining the high-level architecture. At 3:12 a.m., Arthur stood, stretched, and pinned a sheet of paper to the wall. Gentlemen, he said, voice tired but electric. This is the blueprint. It showed a distributed GPU grid across multiple European data centers, a high-bandwidth, encrypted interconnect, region-specific energy optimization, scalable orchestration for future frontier models, a governance layer ensuring compliance with EU ethics and law. Timothy stared at it for a long time. This is enormous. Guillaume whispered. This is insane. Arthur smiled weakly. This is necessary. There was no applause. No dramatic music. Just three exhausted men staring at the future of Europe, and knowing they had to build it. The morning after the blueprint was drafted, Mistral's leadership team gathered in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Seine. Outside, joggers passed by without any idea that inside this building, a plan was forming to reshape Europe's digital future. Arthur stood at the head of the table. We need capital, he said plainly. Not millions, billions. Guillaume leaned forward, hands clasped. American AI companies raise multi-billion rounds like it's nothing. But in Europe, a 100 million euro round is historic. Timothy cracked a thin smile. So we make it historic again. Investors had already been circling Mistral like hawks, venture funds, sovereign wealth, industrial giants. But now the stakes were different. They weren't funding a product. They were funding a continental infrastructure gamble. Arthur clicked to the next slide. Funding needs, 5 to 7 billion euros, initial phase. GPU clusters, data centers, energy-efficient cooling, custom optimization stacks, security teams, safety and alignment layers. A product manager asked hesitantly, do we actually tell investors the real number? Guillaume grinned. They'll ask why it's not more. Timothy added, I want this to scare them, in a good way. Arthur nodded. Then prepare the pitch. We go global. They started in Paris, then London, then Berlin. Then they crossed the Atlantic. New York, Boston, San Francisco. Everywhere they went, boardrooms filled with venture capitalists who thought they had seen everything in AI, only to be humbled within minutes. Arthur opened each pitch the same way. Europe missed the mobile revolution. We won't miss AI. Timothy would dive into the distribution architecture. A model is only as powerful as the infrastructure that trains and deploys it. Guillaume followed with raw compute math. To build the next frontier models, we need orders of magnitude more efficiency. Our algorithms deliver that. Now we need hardware to match. Some investors stared in awe. Some stared in fear. One American billionaire leaned back and said, You're trying to outbuild Google Cloud and Azure in Europe. Arthur replied, Not outbuild, out-innovate. Another investor asked, What if Europe decides to strangle AI with regulation? Guillaume answered without hesitation. Then we'll help Europe write regulation that encourages innovation instead of killing it. A silence. Then the billionaire said quietly, "You're not just building a company. You're building a movement." Arthur didn't respond, but he smiled. As Mistral's fundraising tour gained traction, the American tech giants reacted quickly. Google released a public statement. AI safety requires centralization. OpenAI published a blog post. Open models risk uncontrolled proliferation. Anthropic executives briefed policymakers. Radical openness may destabilize global security. But privately, they were blunt. Mistral is rallying Europe around an alternative AI ecosystem. If they succeed, it weakens our dominance. Rumors spread that certain American companies were pressuring cloud providers to deprioritize Mistral's compute requests. Guillaume stormed into the office one morning, waving his phone. "They're trying to freeze us out." Timothy's jaw clenched. "They're afraid." Arthur remained calm. "They should be." He looked at the blueprint pinned to the wall. "We proceed anyway." The backlash didn't only come from corporations. It came from activists, academics, ethicists, journalists. A popular European newspaper ran a headline: "Mistral, Europe's out-of-control AI startup." A television panel debated: "Why should three men decide Europe's technological fate?" A professor warned: "This level of compute could lead to unregulated superintelligence." Guillaume sighed, reading the commentary. "We open source models, give academic access, publish benchmarks, contribute to safety, and still they paint us like villains." Timothy shrugged. "Innovators always look dangerous to people who fear change." Arthur closed his laptop softly. "They're not afraid of us. They're afraid of what we represent." Which was true. Mistral represented a Europe that no longer asked for permission. One night, close to midnight, Arthur's phone rang. It was the French president's chief technology advisor. "I've read the infrastructure proposal," she said, "and the president wants to discuss it." Arthur's brow furrowed. "Discuss? Or approve?" "Discuss," she replied. "But he likes ambitious projects." The next day, the founders were escorted into the Élysée Palace. The president himself greeted them. He didn't waste time. "France must not become dependent on American AI empires," he said, looking directly at Arthur. "Your plan is bold. Too bold for some. But perhaps boldness is exactly what we need." He paused. "Tell me what you require." Timothy spoke first. "Compute cluster permits. Energy deals. Data center zoning approvals." Guillaume added: "Infrastructure subsidies, streamlined regulation, academic partnerships." Arthur finished. "And political courage." The president's expression didn't change. "You will have what you need, within reason. Just build wisely." When they left the palace, the afternoon sun reflected off the white stone walls, lighting their faces. Guillaume whispered, "Did we just win?" Arthur shook his head. "We haven't even started." Growth brings friction, not among the three founders, but among the team. A faction of researchers wanted to remain purely open source, resisting anything that resembled infrastructure centralization. Another faction wanted to chase enterprise contracts aggressively, arguing that revenue should precede idealism. Debates became heated. One engineer slammed his notebook shut during a meeting. "We're supposed to be enabling innovation, not becoming Europe's AWS." Another countered, "And how do you train billion-parameter models without resources?" Dreams. The founders met privately after the argument. Guillaume leaned back, rubbing his temples. "This will tear the team apart." Timothy sighed. "We need alignment. Internal alignment." Arthur stood near the window, watching the Paris skyline glow at dusk. "We remind them what matters." He turned back to them. "We aren't building infrastructure for profit or for power. We're building it because Europe needs it." Guillaume nodded slowly. Timothy exhaled, relieved. The next day, they held an all-hands meeting. Arthur delivered a speech that became part of Mistral's internal lore. "We are not choosing between openness and infrastructure. We are choosing both, because only together can Europe innovate freely." It calmed the storm. Not entirely, but enough. By early spring, Mistral had secured over 1.5 billion euros in commitments, multiple energy-efficient data center sites across France and Germany, partnership talks with European supercomputing centers, a tentative nod from EU regulators, and private sector allies who saw opportunity, not fear. The work began immediately. Hard hats, high-voltage machinery, massive concrete foundations. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't theoretical. It was real. Guillaume oversaw distributed compute systems. Timothy designed the orchestration architecture. Arthur coordinated government relations and long-term strategy. They weren't researchers anymore. They were pioneers building a digital continent. Late one evening, after visiting a construction site in Frankfurt, the founders sat in a quiet hotel bar. Guillaume took a sip of wine, staring at his tablet. "Do you realize," he murmured, "that if Phase 1 succeeds, Mistral becomes one of the world's largest AI compute operators?" Timothy nodded. "And if Phase 2 works," he added, "we redefine how models are trained globally." Arthur looked out at the city lights. "We're no longer competing with labs," he said softly. "We're competing with nations." They all felt the weight of it. The thrill and the fear intertwined like twin ropes tying them to destiny. The next months would test them more than anything so far. The first massive data center rose in the outskirts of Marseille, a place chosen for its climate, its proximity to undersea cables, and its access to renewable energy. The sea wind carried the scent of salt and warm air as cranes hoisted steel beams into place. Workers in hard hats moved in orchestrated rhythm. The noise was deafening, but also strangely reassuring. Arthur walked along a gravel path beside the construction site, hands in his pockets. A foreman approached. "Mr. Minch, we'll pour the foundation this afternoon." Arthur nodded. "And the cooling system?" "Installed next week." He nodded again. Everything was moving faster than expected, almost frighteningly fast. He walked back to the others. Timothy was reviewing the cluster topology with a group of engineers. Guillaume stood near a portable workstation, staring at live telemetry feeds. Arthur approached them. "It's happening," he said quietly. Guillaume replied without looking up. "It's happening because we're not sleeping." Timothy added, "And because Europe is waking up." Mistral's momentum was unstoppable, at least on paper. But behind the scenes, forces were moving against them. The interference was subtle at first. A shipment of GPUs delayed due to logistical issues. A major supplier suddenly pulled out of a deal. A cloud provider quietly deprioritized their access. Negative research critiques, appearing suspiciously timed. Then the whispers began. Certain American players don't want a European competitor. They're lobbying regulators. They're pressuring manufacturers. One evening, Guillaume burst into Arthur's office. "They're trying to strangle our supply lines." Timothy entered moments later. "We need to secure alternative pipelines." Arthur remained calm, visibly so, but inside, uncertainty churned like a storm front. "Then we build redundancies," he said. "And we build alliances." They reached out to South Korean chip suppliers, Scandinavian renewable energy partners, Middle Eastern sovereign funds, European HPC centers, Japanese semiconductor firms. Every new alliance made Mistral harder to kill. The giants had underestimated something: Europe's appetite for independence. It came on a cold morning in March. A red alert spread across internal dashboards. The data center's main cooling array had malfunctioned. One of the largest GPU clusters in Europe was overheating. Guillaume sprinted through the facility, followed by engineers in bright vests. Rows of servers blinked erratically. The temperature kept climbing. "We need to shut down the entire cluster," a technician shouted. "If we shut it down," Guillaume snapped, "we lose 2 weeks of training." Timothy appeared behind him, breathless. "We need to isolate the fault, now." Arthur arrived minutes later. "What's the status?" Guillaume answered, sweating. "We're minutes away from destroying €50 million worth of hardware." Arthur looked at them, calm despite the chaos. "Save the hardware," he said. "Training can be rerun. Machines cannot." As if on cue, a high-pitched warning blared across the facility. Timothy yelled over the noise. "We're doing a soft shutdown, controlled, node by node." Guillaume's fingers flew across his keyboard. Redirecting thermal load. Rescheduling jobs. Arthur stood behind them, silent, steady, a human anchor in the boiling storm. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, temperatures dropped. The fans roared to life. The system stabilized. The cluster lived. Everyone exhaled in unison. Guillaume slid down the wall, exhausted. Timothy sat on the floor, head back, laughing weakly. Arthur crouched beside them. "That," he said softly, "was our first true crisis." "But not our last," Timothy added. Arthur nodded. "Good. It means we're doing something that matters." The crisis nearly broke them. But surviving it changed something, not just within Mistral, but across Europe. News of the near disaster leaked. At first, critics jumped. See? This is too risky. But something else happened. In the following days, universities wrote to express support. Energy companies offered collaboration. Two governments offered expedited infrastructure permits. European startups began aligning themselves with Mistral as the backbone of a new ecosystem. A Dutch newspaper published a headline: Mistral AI, Europe's first technological vanguard of the 21st century. A German magazine wrote, "For the first time in decades, we are not following. We are leading." People were rooting for them, not as a startup, but as a symbol. Mistral wasn't just building AI infrastructure. They were building European technological confidence. With new support, Phase 2 began. Across Europe, interlinked compute grid spanning France, Germany, and the Netherlands. A sustainability-first energy architecture using hydropower and geothermal. A European-scale model deployment system. A new generation of training loops designed for trillion-parameter models. A governance framework balancing openness with oversight. During a late-night planning session, Guillaume stared at a diagram. "This is massive," he whispered. Timothy looked at him. "That's the point." Arthur joined them. "We aren't building for today," he said. "We're building for the decade ahead." Guillaume exhaled slowly. "And when this is done," Arthur finished the thought, "when this is done, Europe will have its own foundation, its own voice, its own power." It happened unexpectedly. A newspaper in Japan ran a story titled, "The AI Superpowers, US, China, and Europe?" A US analyst testified in Congress. Mistral AI has fundamentally altered the global AI balance. A Chinese researcher posted anonymously, "We underestimated them." And then came the message that stunned all three founders. An email from a Nobel laureate. Subject: "You are building the future of civilization." Body: "Do not stop." Guillaume stared at it, speechless. Timothy read it twice. Arthur folded the laptop slowly. They had crossed a threshold. They weren't outsiders anymore. They weren't underdogs. They were shapers of the century. And it scared them, in a way that felt both heavy and necessary. On the final night before Phase 3 began, the founders stood on the rooftop of their headquarters. Paris glowed below them, the Seine like a ribbon of liquid silver. Guillaume spoke first. "When we started, people laughed at the idea of a French LLM." Timothy added, "And now we're building one of the most ambitious infrastructures on Earth." Arthur looked out at the skyline. "This is only the beginning." The wind picked up, cool and strong. The same wind that gave their company its name. Mistral. A wind that reshapes landscapes. A wind that never stops once it rises. And the chapter ended. Not with triumph. Not with closure. But with momentum. The kind that signals the storm ahead. By early summer, Mistral AI had established itself as Europe's vanguard in AI infrastructure. The first phase of their distributed data center grid hummed quietly across France, Germany, and the Netherlands. The system was stable, scalable, and efficient, an achievement few had thought possible in such a short time. Yet the world of AI does not pause. News arrived via the usual channels. Leaked preprints from American labs hinted at models far beyond the trillion-parameter scale. A Chinese competitor quietly released a new generative model that achieved state-of-the-art results in multilingual benchmarks. Guillaume paced in the Marseille Operations Center, voice tense. "They're moving faster than we anticipated." Timothy tapped a graph on his tablet, projecting training timelines and model scalability. "We're not behind yet, but the gap is closing rapidly." Arthur leaned against the server rack, eyes scanning the blinking lights. "Then we accelerate. Not incrementally. Exponentially." The word exponentially hung in the air, heavy with both promise and peril. Europe's gamble wasn't just about infrastructure anymore. It was about frontier models, the next generation that would determine global AI leadership. To compete on this scale, Mistral needed talent, the kind of talent that usually flowed towards Silicon Valley. Arthur convened a meeting in the main conference hall, a room filled with whiteboards, monitors, and the hum of servers. "We are no longer a research lab. We are a battleground," he said, pacing. "And the most important weapon is the human brain." Timothy added, "We need researchers who can think in algorithms, engineers who can optimize at petaflop scale, and visionaries who can imagine models no one else dares touch." Guillaume smirked. "You mean we need the impossible?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Exactly. Recruiting campaigns began. Offers were made, travel arrangements handled, visas expedited. Universities in Paris, Berlin, and Zurich became unofficial feeders for Mistral. Former engineers from American labs were persuaded to join with promises of European autonomy, creative freedom, and unprecedented model-scale challenges. Within weeks, the team doubled. Within months, it tripled. And with each addition, Mistral's ambitions grew, but so did the complexity of management. Training schedules were drawn. Models were selected. Experiments began. Mistral Nova became the code name for their next-generation architecture, a massive mixture of experts system designed to scale efficiently across the entire European grid. Late one night, Guillaume and Timothy watched as the first training run commenced. The monitors flickered with real-time metrics, parameter updates, attention weight distributions, memory bandwidth utilization. Guillaume muttered, "If this fails, all of Phase 2 feels pointless." Timothy shrugged. "If it succeeds, the world notices." Arthur, sipping stale coffee, observed quietly. The run lasted hours. Logs scrolled like digital rain. At 2:47 a.m., the first coherent sample emerged. A prompt typed in French described the future of European AI in one sentence. The model replied, with an elegance and clarity that made the room silent. "Europe will rise not by following the wind, but by shaping it." Guillaume let out a low whistle. Timothy smiled faintly. Arthur nodded. It was more than a model output. It was a statement of intent. As Mistral Nova drew attention, alliances formed, and tension followed. A meeting with the European Commission revealed new challenges. Officials wanted oversight, safety protocols, and assurances of ethical deployment. Arthur explained patiently, "We've designed governance layers into the infrastructure. Access can be monitored. Alignment metrics are tracked. Safety checks are built in at every stage." An official pressed further. "What about unintended consequences? Data misuse? Geopolitical risks?" Timothy interjected, "These are real risks. But stagnation is a greater risk. If Europe cedes AI development entirely, strategic dependence becomes permanent." Guillaume leaned forward, voice firm. "We are building responsibly, but we cannot wait for perfection to act. That is the luxury of others. We have no such luxury." The debate ended in compromise. Mistral retained operational autonomy, but formal reporting and safety audits were codified. This balance, independence with oversight, became a defining feature of the company's ethos. The launch of early Mistral Nova benchmarks triggered international coverage. Headlines read, "Europe enters the AI supermodel race." French startup challenges Silicon Valley giants. Mistral, the AI windstorm. Social media analysts debated efficiency, multilingual abilities, and model robustness. Academic papers began citing Mistral Nova as a benchmark for European AI ingenuity. Arthur, watching the flurry, leaned back. "They think this is just hype," he said. Guillaume responded, "Let's make sure the models back it up." Indeed, the next few months would test whether Mistral could not only promise innovation but deliver it at scale. With frontier models came unprecedented responsibility. Timothy conducted a deep-dive safety review one evening. He flagged subtle biases in the training data that could propagate if unchecked. Guillaume argued, "We can clean the data, but full perfection is impossible. You know that." Arthur summarized the philosophy. "We aim for rigorous, transparent oversight, not impossible purity." Ethical AI isn't about perfection. It's about accountability and iteration. They implemented multi-tiered safety checks, continuous alignment monitoring, and open-source audits for transparency. Mistral's reputation as a responsible, European-first AI organization was solidifying, a differentiator that Silicon Valley often overlooked. The pressure arrived in the form of a multinational consortium. They wanted Mistral Nova's model for enterprise and governmental analysis, but their demands were intense. Custom training on sensitive data, rapid deployment timelines, stringent compliance with multiple jurisdictions. Arthur, Guillaume, and Timothy debated, take the revenue and risk overextension or protect the long-term vision. Arthur finally decided, "We honor the partnership but maintain control. No shortcuts, no compromises on infrastructure integrity or ethical standards." Guillaume grinned. "It's terrifying, and exactly why it will work." The deal proceeded, validating Mistral's ability to handle enterprise-scale demand without sacrificing independence. By autumn, Mistral Nova was no longer a secret. Researchers, investors, and policymakers worldwide tracked every benchmark and release. The success of the infrastructure and early model deployments had placed Mistral at the center of a rapidly intensifying global AI race. One morning, Arthur received a call from a European intelligence advisor. You need to be aware. US and Chinese labs are attempting to replicate your distributed systems architecture. They're accelerating their timelines aggressively. Arthur paused, processing the words. They're racing us now, he said quietly to Guillaume and Timothy. Guillaume clenched his fists. Then we accelerate harder. Timothy, ever the mathematician, added. It's not just speed. It's precision, alignment, and sustainable scaling. If we cut corners, we risk catastrophic failure. Arthur nodded. Then we perfect as we race. Europe was now not just a participant in AI. It was a competitor in a high-stakes global duel. The pressure of running frontier models exposed new vulnerabilities. A distributed training node in Germany overheated, causing a temporary shutdown. Data throughput issues in Marseille led to inconsistencies in model outputs. A security breach attempt was detected and neutralized just in time. Each incident, minor in isolation, threatened the perception of reliability. Guillaume spent nights debugging the system. Timothy recalibrated the training schedules, and Arthur coordinated with government officials to ensure no regulatory alarm was triggered. After a particularly harrowing week, Guillaume slumped in his chair. This is bigger than we imagined. Every node, every byte, every connection, one mistake could cascade into a disaster. Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder. That's exactly why we built redundancy. That's why we built governance layers. We're designing with catastrophe in mind. Timothy added, quietly, it's a test, not of technology alone, but of willpower and strategy. The team emerged from the crisis stronger, more disciplined, and acutely aware of the stakes of frontier AI. As Mistral Nova's capabilities expanded, so did the ethical debates. Governments requested access for surveillance, law enforcement, and predictive analytics. Corporations requested fine-tuning for financial and operational dominance. The boardroom became a battleground of philosophy. One executive argued, revenue and adoption are essential. We can shape Europe by proving capability. Arthur countered, we will never sacrifice core values for profit. Mistral must lead responsibly, not just technically. Timothy added, our transparency and alignment frameworks are not suggestions. They're commitments. Compromising them undermines trust and Europe's sovereignty. Guillaume, usually pragmatic, remarked, ethics and ambition are constantly colliding. We just need to make sure ambition doesn't crush ethics. It became a recurring mantra, power with oversight, speed with responsibility. A European government invited Mistral to conduct a live demonstration of Nova's predictive analytics system on anonymized urban planning and climate modeling data. Hundreds of policymakers, journalists, and academics observed. Guillaume operated the interface, Timothy monitored accuracy metrics, and Arthur presented strategic interpretations. When the results were displayed, clear, precise, and actionable, the audience erupted into applause. A senior EU minister leaned toward Arthur. Your team is not just building models. You are building trust. Arthur smiled, quietly noting that trust, once broken, is far harder to regain than technology. The success of the demonstration drew global scrutiny. American and Chinese labs issued preemptive research papers to overshadow Mistral's achievements. Some media outlets questioned the open-source model releases, framing them as dangerous. A minor but coordinated cyber attack targeted Nova's distributed network, quickly contained but raising alarm. Guillaume slammed his fist on the desk. They think they can slow us down. They're wrong. Arthur remained composed. Interference is inevitable. We adapt, we strengthen, and we stay ahead. That's our strategy. Timothy added, we've built redundancy into every system. The architecture itself is resistant to disruption. This phase of confrontation became a defining moment. Mistral's technical innovation was inseparable from geopolitical and strategic dynamics. Late at night, after a particularly grueling week, the founders met atop their Paris headquarters. The city lights stretched endlessly. Guillaume spoke first. When we started, We were just three people with an idea. Now we're building a European backbone, and the world is watching. Timothy reflected. It's not just technology anymore. It's responsibility, politics, and influence. Every choice we make echoes globally. Arthur concluded. We underestimated the weight of being pioneers. But we've learned, leadership in AI is not about speed alone. It's about strategy, ethics, and resilience. They sat in silence for a while, absorbing the gravity of their journey. Outside, the wind rose again, a fitting emblem of Mistral's unstoppable trajectory. The founders now faced the ultimate challenge, scaling Nova and the European AI infrastructure to global prominence. Plans for Phase 3 included training trillion-parameter models with fully optimized distributed systems, expanding data center coverage to Scandinavia and Southern Europe, enhancing AI alignment and oversight frameworks, engaging with industry partners for real-world deployments while maintaining independence. Each decision required balancing speed, scale, ethics, and geopolitical implications. Arthur, Guillaume, and Timothy realized that the next stage would test not only technology but character. Europe's gamble on next-gen AI was about to reach its defining moment. By winter, Mistral Nova had matured into a powerful testbed for next-generation models. The European AI infrastructure had grown to include more than 15,000 GPUs distributed across multiple countries, backed by renewable energy and advanced governance systems. The first real test of international pressure came unexpectedly. A consortium of foreign research labs, led by Silicon Valley and East Asian tech giants, proposed a collaborative benchmark challenge. Publicly, it was framed as an academic exercise, but privately, it was a contest designed to assess and potentially undermine Mistral's infrastructure and algorithms. Guillaume scowled at the invitation. They want to see if we can hold under scrutiny, and if we fail, they win the narrative. Arthur replied calmly. Then we prove them wrong. Timothy added, not with words, with performance, ethics, and reliability. The challenge would be Mistral's first truly global confrontation. Training schedules for Mistral Nova were intensified. Models that previously took weeks to converge were now being pushed to their operational limits. Servers ran continuously, energy flows were optimized, and distributed algorithms were fine-tuned. Every GPU, every interconnect, every node became critical. Late one night, Guillaume noticed irregular spikes in memory usage. If this escalates, the cluster could crash. Timothy quickly recalibrated the parallel training schedules. We need to redistribute workloads across the grid and prioritize redundancy. Arthur monitored reports from the Commission liaison. The eyes of Europe and the world are on us. We cannot fail. For hours, they watched logs scroll, tracking every parameter update, every attention wait, every checkpoint. The tension was electric. The faintest misstep could mean catastrophic failure or international embarrassment. After several days of relentless computation, Nova produced outputs that surpassed all public benchmarks. Multilingual understanding exceeded any comparable model. Predictive reasoning on scientific and economic datasets reached near-human levels. Efficiency per parameter outstripped even state-of-the-art US models. The world began to take notice. But the breakthrough came with its own challenges. A minor software bug triggered misalignment in a cluster, creating inconsistent outputs. An external audit flagged it. Headlines read, Mistral AI, brilliant but risky? Inside the control room, Guillaume muttered, we're brilliant and risky. Timothy shrugged. Every frontier has risks. We just need to manage them. Arthur reminded the team, innovation is never comfortable. Success is earned by navigating discomfort. The success forced the founders to confront deeper questions about their role in the AI ecosystem. One evening, Arthur spoke quietly. We are building Europe's AI future. But what does that mean for society? For governance? For the people we ultimately serve? Guillaume responded, we built the wind. But can we control the storms it creates? Timothy added, we must assume responsibility for misuse, for accidents, for unintended consequences. If we don't, no technical success matters. They realized that technological breakthroughs were inseparable from philosophy, policy, and ethics. Mistral Nova was no longer just a model. It was a statement about Europe's place in a global AI order. After the benchmark results were published, Mistral received recognition on multiple fronts. Invitations to advise governments on AI policy, offers from global universities to co-develop frontier research, media acclaim positioning Europe as a serious player in AI innovation. Arthur received a message from a U.S. think tank. Your infrastructure and model performance are changing the global AI narrative. We underestimated you. Guillaume leaned back in his chair. Europe underestimated us too. Timothy quietly added. And now we must show them we are trustworthy, competent, and ethical, or all gains will be lost. A summit in Brussels convened key stakeholders, government officials, researchers, industry partners, and Mistral's leadership. Arthur opened the discussion. We've built the infrastructure. We've proven the model's capabilities. Now the question is, how do we integrate this responsibly into society? Debates flared. Ethical frameworks, privacy concerns, and industrial applications all collided. Guillaume remarked privately, "Never thought our biggest challenge would be people's trust, not technology." Timothy agreed. The power of our models is only as meaningful as the social license to operate them. Arthur concluded the summit with a clear message. Mistral's mission is to advance AI while safeguarding humanity, Europe's autonomy, and global cooperation. We accept scrutiny because responsibility is inseparable from power. As the year closed, Mistral had achieved unprecedented milestones. Phase 2 infrastructure was fully operational. Nova's frontier models rivaled and often surpassed global competitors. European governments trusted Mistral as a strategic partner. Academic and corporate ecosystems aligned around Mistral's frameworks. The founders gathered on the rooftop of their Paris headquarters. Guillaume broke the silence. "We've done the impossible." Timothy added, "But the next stage is even more unpredictable." Arthur looked at the wind moving across the Seine below. "This is the tipping point. We've proven Europe can compete. But now we must decide, how far do we push?" The answer was unclear. But one truth was certain. Mistral was no longer just a company. It was a continent's claim to technological sovereignty, and the world would never forget it. The Mistral founders stood once more on the rooftop of their Paris headquarters. The city stretched beneath them like a living network of light and shadow. Autumn winds carried the faint scent of rain from the Seine. Arthur spoke first, voice measured but heavy with meaning. "When we started, we were three people with an idea, a model, a dream. Now we are shaping a continent." Guillaume's eyes lingered on the lights. "We've built infrastructure, models, and partnerships. But what have we built for the world?" Timothy added softly, "We've shown Europe can compete. But now, responsibility defines our legacy." The wind lifted, cold and relentless. It had always been their metaphor. Mistral, the wind that changes landscapes, that shifts systems, that cannot be ignored. Arthur nodded. The legacy is not the models. It is the framework, technological, ethical, and societal. That is what Europe takes forward. Inside the conference hall, Mistral convened their internal leadership team for what they called the Philosophical Summit. The agenda: define the principles guiding European AI. Arthur began. "We are not chasing America or China. We are building Europe's own path." Guillaume interjected. "That means openness, sovereignty, and long-term thinking. No shortcuts, no blind adoption." Timothy laid out their alignment strategy. Ethical oversight baked into every model. Transparent governance for academia and industry. Adaptive policies for societal integration. Arthur summarized. "Our philosophy is simple. Europe must lead responsibly. Power must be tempered by ethics. Innovation must coexist with oversight. And autonomy must coexist with collaboration." The team nodded. It was ambitious, almost utopian, but achievable. The vision extended beyond profit, beyond prestige, beyond even technology itself. Mistral's rapid valuation growth and market attention had made the founders materially wealthy. But wealth was not their primary compass. Meetings with early investors emphasized growth, market penetration, and ROI. Arthur stood firm. "We take funding, yes, but we do not compromise independence, ethics, or strategy. Europe's technological sovereignty is non-negotiable." Guillaume noted wryly, "We're profitable, yes. But the real value is in influence. And influence is measured by trust, not dollars." Timothy added, Our partnerships with governments and enterprises must always reinforce the infrastructure, not compromise it. The lesson was clear. Financial success and societal responsibility were not mutually exclusive, they were intertwined. Mistral began formal programs to mentor European startups in AI infrastructure, training, and alignment. The founders understood that legacy isn't only built by the hands of founders, but by the communities they nurture. Workshops, coding sprints, and infrastructure seminars proliferated across Paris, Berlin, Zurich, and beyond. Researchers who once sought American labs now looked to Europe as a viable frontier. Arthur reflected privately. We built the backbone. Now we must populate it with minds capable of sustaining it. Guillaume nodded. It's not about creating clones. It's about fostering ecosystems. Timothy added. Every mentee is a node in the European AI grid. Intellectual, ethical, and operational. Mistral had become a nucleus for talent and innovation, a symbol that Europe could cultivate both excellence and responsibility simultaneously. By the end of the first full operational year of Nova Phase 3, global researchers studied Mistral's infrastructure and training paradigms. Policymakers across continents debated regulatory frameworks influenced by their governance model. Media hailed Europe's boldness and strategic foresight. Arthur read a note from a policy think tank in Washington, D.C. Mistral's approach has shifted how the world thinks about AI infrastructure, scaling, and governance. Guillaume remarked dryly. So much for being just a startup. Timothy smiled faintly. It never was just a startup. It was a claim to the future. The founders realized that with recognition came scrutiny, and scrutiny demanded discipline, transparency, and courage. Not all moments were celebratory. A minor alignment failure during a deployment caused a cascade of unexpected outputs. Media sensationalized it as a European AI mishap, though the incident was swiftly contained. Arthur gathered the leadership team. Crises are not setbacks. They are lessons. They teach resilience, ethical rigor, and humility. Guillaume, exhausted from monitoring logs for hours, added, every bug, every anomaly is an opportunity to improve, not just technology, but process, governance, and trust. Timothy concluded, alignment is continuous. Learning never stops. That is the ultimate frontier. This mindset became embedded in Mistral's culture. Crisis is inevitable, but failure is optional if approached with discipline and foresight. Mistral's founders recognized that Europe's AI influence extended beyond national borders. They established transparent audit protocols, open research collaborations with ethical guardrails, advisory councils with civil society representatives, public dashboards demonstrating alignment metrics. Arthur reflected during one of the council meetings. Power without accountability is destructive. Influence without ethics is fleeting. If Europe wishes to compete, we must lead responsibly. Guillaume nodded. And that will define our legacy more than the models themselves. Timothy added. The world is watching. Our success is measured not by what we build, but by what we enable, safely, equitably, and sustainably. On the final day of the Philosophical Summit, Arthur addressed the team. We've done more than build technology. We've demonstrated that Europe can define its own path in AI. We've aligned ambition with ethics, power with responsibility, wealth with purpose. That is our inheritance, for Europe, for the world, and for the future. The room was silent. The weight of the message, the achievements, and the responsibility settled over every person present. Outside, the Mistral wind stirred again, subtle, relentless, shaping landscapes unseen. Europe's AI era had arrived, and the founders had ensured it was a wind that would not be ignored. Mistral's founders gathered in a high-ceilinged conference room overlooking Paris, the city's lights reflecting off the Seine. Phase 3 of Mistral Nova was operational, but the work ahead was even more ambitious. Global integration, model scaling, and ethical standard setting. Arthur began. We've built Europe's backbone, but the next phase is about shaping global norms. Our models, our infrastructure, our governance, they set precedents. Guillaume leaned forward. Global competitors are watching. They will mirror, circumvent, or challenge us. Our advantage is not only technology, it's foresight, ethics, and adaptability. Timothy added, pointing to a schematic of distributed training nodes. The network must expand, yes. But every expansion carries risk. Political, social, operational. Strategy must always outweigh speed. Arthur nodded. Europe can lead AI, but only if we integrate foresight, ethics, and resilience into every decision. Mistral began a series of initiatives to establish alliances. Academic partnerships. Universities across Europe, Asia, and North America were invited to collaborate on research while adhering to Mistral's alignment protocols. Corporate collaborations. Select enterprises gained access to Nova under strict ethical and operational guidelines. Policy advisory. Mistral advised governments on AI safety, transparency, and sovereignty frameworks. Open research initiatives. Key datasets and alignment tools were released publicly to foster responsible innovation. Arthur reflected privately. Power is fleeting without influence. Influence is meaningless without trust. Trust comes from responsible collaboration. Guillaume smiled, adding, Europe is no longer a follower. We are a hub, a nexus, and the world is noticing. Late one evening, the founders walked along the Seine. Streetlights reflected in the water, creating ribbons of gold and silver. Arthur spoke. We've built models capable of influencing decisions, understanding human nuance, and processing global datasets at scale. The potential is enormous and terrifying. Timothy replied. Every action, every release, every partnership must be weighed. AI is a tool, but it can amplify every human decision, good or bad. Guillaume added. Our responsibility extends beyond Europe. Decisions we make ripple globally. That's why our frameworks matter more than any benchmark. Arthur paused, looking at the water. We are the custodians of this era. That is the heaviest responsibility we carry, heavier than any investor meeting, any technical challenge, any competitor. Despite their public success, the founders grappled privately with the human cost of relentless ambition. Guillaume admitted during a candid meeting, I've sacrificed sleep, relationships, and peace of mind. And yet, I feel more alive than ever. Because we are shaping history. Timothy added, success is a paradox. It brings freedom, wealth, recognition, and relentless pressure. But it also brings purpose. Arthur, staring at a whiteboard filled with model metrics and ethical guidelines, said softly, we built infrastructure, models, and governance. But our real achievement is the precedent that innovation and responsibility can coexist at scale. The founders began designing mentorship and incubation programs to ensure that European AI talent would continue to flourish. Summer fellowships for university students, collaboration hubs for startups across Europe, leadership workshops for researchers entering AI governance. Timothy explained, legacy is not only the models or infrastructure we build, it's the minds we shape. Guillaume added, every mentee is a potential guardian of ethical, powerful AI in the future. Arthur concluded, Europe will outlive us. Let's ensure it remains a leader in technology and ethics, not just a participant. The achievements of Mistral Nova and its infrastructure drew unprecedented global attention. Policy think tanks cited their governance frameworks as exemplary. International AI alliances invited Mistral to lead working groups. Media outlets dubbed Europe the third AI superpower, alongside the US and China. Arthur reflected, recognition is meaningful, but influence is lasting. We aim for influence that shapes ethics, innovation, and opportunity for decades to come. Guillaume nodded. Every partnership, every deployment, every collaboration is a test, not of technology, but of integrity. Timothy added, and it is a test we intend to pass. Mistral's leadership codified a philosophy that would guide Europe's AI ecosystem for generations. Sovereignty. Europe controls its own AI infrastructure and strategic direction. Ethics, transparency, alignment, and social responsibility are non-negotiable. Collaboration. Openness fosters innovation, but within structured, accountable frameworks. Sustainability. Energy efficiency and environmental responsibility underpin all deployments. Education and mentorship. Human capital is the most enduring asset. Arthur summarized to the team. This ethos is our gift to Europe. It's our declaration that innovation can coexist with morality, power with accountability, and speed with reflection. The founders stood together, looking out over the city, Paris, luminous and alive, a testament to the possibilities of a continent daring to lead. Mistral's founders had transformed from three ambitious individuals into symbols of Europe's AI ambition. Their personal wealth, amassed through early investments, equity in infrastructure, and strategic partnerships, was significant, but their vision extended far beyond financial gain. Arthur reflected privately. Money is a measure, but not a purpose. The true legacy is the systems we've built and the precedent we've set. Guillaume, reviewing infrastructure metrics from multiple data centers, added, our models, our governance, our mentorship programs, these define our contribution more than any valuation. Timothy nodded. And we've made Europe credible. The world can no longer ignore our voice in AI strategy and ethics. The founders understood that power and wealth came with immense responsibility. Governments sought advice on AI regulation. Corporations proposed ambitious collaborations. Researchers requested access to Nova's infrastructure for frontier studies. Arthur emphasized, we control the levers, but we must wield them with care. Influence is a privilege, not a tool for dominance. Guillaume added, every deployment, every contract, every partnership must strengthen European sovereignty without compromising our ethical standards. Timothy summarized the philosophy. Leadership is not the ability to enforce, it's the ability to enable responsibly. Years of relentless work took a toll. Sleep was scarce, personal relationships were strained, and the weight of global scrutiny was constant. Guillaume, late one evening, remarked, I've seen the edge of burnout, but the work matters more than comfort. Timothy added, the challenge is eternal. AI doesn't pause. Neither can we, but we can be deliberate, reflective, and humane in how we operate. Arthur reflected, the human cost is undeniable. Yet we've grown, personally, ethically, and intellectually. That is part of the legacy too. The founders initiated programs to ensure European AI was self-sustaining. Startup incubators focused on alignment, infrastructure, and applications. Training academies to cultivate the next generation of engineers and researchers. Governance frameworks embedded in policy discussions, EU directives, and ethical councils. Arthur explained in an interview, we are building not just models, but a continent-wide ecosystem that can thrive independently, responsibly, and sustainably. Guillaume noted, the real measure of success is not how many models we train, but how many teams we empower. The founders' personal financial gains were substantial, amplified by early-stage investment and market success. Yet Arthur reflected, wealth is a tool for influence, experimentation, and societal impact. It is not an end in itself. Guillaume added, we have resources. We can attract talent, invest in infrastructure, and support ethical AI research globally. That's true leverage. Timothy summed up, money without purpose is meaningless. Purpose without resources is powerless. We've aligned both. Even as Mistral Nova scaled and Europe gained influence, the founders understood the next decade would bring unforeseen challenges. Frontier models requiring exascale computation. Ethical dilemmas arising from superintelligent capabilities. Global geopolitical pressures and competition. Climate and sustainability constraints for massive data infrastructure. Arthur spoke at a private meeting. Our vision must remain long-term. Europe can lead, but leadership demands humility, foresight, and adaptability. Guillaume replied, and resilience. Crises will come, failures will occur, but preparation, ethics, and unity will define survival and impact. Timothy concluded, the horizon is both bright and uncertain. That is the nature of pioneering. On the rooftop of their Paris headquarters, the founders once again stood together, looking out at the city that had become the heart of Europe's AI movement. Arthur spoke softly. We are not just shaping models or infrastructure. We are shaping the future of innovation, ethics, and leadership. Guillaume added, our work proves that Europe can compete, lead, and inspire without compromise. Timothy smiled. And that is the greatest legacy of all. Knowledge, responsibility, influence, a wind that moves continents. The night air carried a faint breeze, symbolic of the Mistral, persistent, shaping, unstoppable. For Arthur, Guillaume, and Timothy, the journey was far from over. But the foundation had been laid. Europe was no longer a spectator in AI. It was a leader, The founders turned from the skyline, carrying the weight of responsibility, vision, and ambition, prepared to face whatever challenges the next generation would bring.